The silk of the wedding dress felt alien against Ilara's skin. It was a borrowed gown, loaned by a third cousin who had married well and possessed a charitable heart. The fabric was heavy, opulent, and utterly false. It whispered of a joy she did not feel, a future she did not want, and a union born not of affection, but of desperation. From her place by the window, she watched the grey morning light spill over the manicured lawns of her family's rented London house. Rented, the word itself was a humiliation. At 24, Ilara Vance was a spinster. It was a title she had come to accept with the same quiet resignation she accepted most things: the watered-down soup at dinner, the worn-out soles of her walking shoes, the pitying glances of women her age who were already on their second or third child. Her father's disastrous foray into shipping speculation had stripped them of everything but their name, and a name, she had learned, could not fill an empty larder. Then the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood had descended upon them. She had not made an offer, she had issued a decree. Her son, the formidable and aloof Duke, needed a wife. Ilara, with her respectable bloodline and desperate circumstances, was a suitable and, more importantly, pliable candidate. There was no courtship, no exchange of pleasantries. There was only a contract, signed by her trembling father, that felt more like a bill of sale. Her mother had wept with relief. Her father had taken to his study with a bottle of brandy, his shoulders slumped with the shame of having sold his only daughter. Ilara had felt nothing at all. It was as if a part of her had already been hollowed out, leaving behind a placid emptiness that was immune to further pain. She was to be a duchess. It was a fate other women dreamed of. To Ilara, it felt like a beautifully gilded cage, and she had long since forgotten how to fly. A knock came at the door, soft and hesitant. It was Mary, her maid for the past decade, her face a mask of worried sympathy. "It is time, my lady." Ilara turned from the window. She did not look in the mirror. She did not want to see the stranger staring back at her, adorned for sacrifice. She simply nodded, her fingers smoothing a wrinkle in the borrowed silk. The gesture was automatic, devoid of feeling. She was ready. She had been ready for this ending for a very long time. The church was cold. Stone pillars soared into a vaulted ceiling where shadows clung like ancient secrets. The air smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and the funereal perfume of lilies. Ilara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, his grip unsteady, his breathing shallow. She kept her eyes fixed on the altar, on the rigid back of the man who was to be her husband. She had never met him. She had seen portraits, of course, a severe, unsmiling man with a strong jaw and eyes that seemed to look right through the artist. As she reached the chancel steps, he turned. The portraits had not done him justice. They had captured the form but not the fire. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, was taller than she had imagined, and the coldness in his features was not passive but active, a living, breathing force. His eyes, a startling shade of deep burning amber, were fixed on her, and in their depths, she saw an emotion so pure and undiluted it made her breath catch. It was fury. A white-hot, silent rage that was directed entirely at her. He did not take her hand. He simply stood, a statue of granite and ice, as her father placed her trembling fingers into the crook of his arm. His sleeve was fine wool, but she imagined she could feel the heat of his anger through the fabric. The priest began to speak, his voice a droning monotone that seemed to come from a great distance. Ilara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back, but the only presence she could feel was the searing heat of the man beside her. When the time came for his vows, his voice was low and clipped, each word a shard of glass. "I will." The phrase was not a promise. It was a sentence, delivered with the brutal finality of a judge's gavel. He was marrying her, yes, he was binding himself to her as his mother had commanded, as society demanded. But he was not accepting her. He was condemning her. Her own I will was a whisper, lost in the cavernous space of the church. She felt the cold weight of the ring slide onto her finger. It was heavy, a manacle. The priest declared them man and wife. The Duke did not move. He did not look at her. The instruction to kiss his bride hung in the air, a mortifying, unanswered question. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he made a stiff, almost imperceptible bow of his head, a gesture of dismissal. The ordeal was over. Her new life had begun. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was a study in silence. His silence was a presence, thick and heavy like a velvet curtain dropped over a stage. Elara sat perfectly still on the plush velvet seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing countryside. She did not dare look at him. The fury she had seen in the church had now settled into a glacial stillness, which was somehow more terrifying. He sat opposite her, his long legs stretched out, his posture one of arrogant disregard. He had not spoken a single word to her since the ceremony. She studied his hands. They were large and well-shaped, but what struck her were the faint, dark stains around his fingernails and along the edge of his thumb, as if he worked with ink or charcoal. It was an odd detail for a duke, a man whose hands should have been pristine. The observation was a small, useless thing, a piece of flotsam to cling to in the vast, silent ocean of his displeasure. The manor, when it came into view, was breathtaking. It was less a house, and more a fortress of grey stone, sprawling across a low hill, its mullioned windows like 1,000 unblinking eyes. It was magnificent, imposing, and as cold as its master. The staff were lined up on the steps, a sea of black and white uniforms, their faces carefully blank. An elderly butler with a face like a dried apple stepped forward. "Your Grace." "Welcome home." "Your Grace." He inclined his head toward Elara, his expression unreadable. "Have the Duchess's things taken to the East Wing," the Duke said, his first words to anyone. The command was sharp, precise, the East Wing, as far from the Master's suite in the West Wing as one could possibly get. Elara followed a young housemaid up a grand, curving staircase, her footsteps echoing in the unnerving quiet. The East Wing was beautiful, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of pale blue and cream, with a fire already crackling in the hearth. It was also utterly isolated. She stood in the center of the sitting room, the borrowed wedding dress suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She was a duchess. She was the mistress of this great house. And she had never felt more like a ghost. The days that followed fell into a rigid, lonely pattern. She took her meals alone in her rooms. The Duke, she was informed by her maid, took his in his study. They were two solitary planets, orbiting a sun of mutual misery, their paths never crossing. She explored the house with a quiet, aimless dread, drifting through state rooms shrouded in dust covers and galleries where the portraits of his ancestors stared down at her with accusatory eyes. She found the library on the third day. It was the only room in the house that felt alive. 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books, it was a cathedral of the written word. A fire burned in the hearth, and the air smelled of leather and old paper. She felt a pang of something that was almost relief. Here, at least, was a sanctuary. She spent her afternoons there, losing herself in novels and poetry, the silence a comfortable blanket rather than a suffocating shroud. She had brought one book with her from home, a small, worn volume filled with pressed flowers she had collected over the years. It was a foolish, sentimental thing, a relic of a girlhood she barely remembered. One afternoon, engrossed in a book, she left it on a reading table by the window. When she returned the next day, it was gone. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her. It was the only thing that was truly hers. She searched the table, the floor, the nearby shelves, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was not there. She sank into a chair, the loss feeling disproportionate, absurd. It was just a book of dead flowers. But it was her book. It was a piece of her soul. That evening, when she returned to her rooms, she saw it immediately. It was sitting on her bedside table, placed perfectly in the center. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew. He had found it, and he had returned it. He had entered her rooms or had a servant do so to place this small, insignificant piece of her life back where it belonged. The gesture was inexplicable. It was a crack in the wall of his icy indifference, a sliver of light in the suffocating dark. A week later, they had their first dinner guests, a neighboring earl and his wife, a vapid woman with a voice like shattering glass. Elara dreaded the evening, the necessity of playing a role she did not know how to perform. She dressed in a simple gown of deep blue, the Blackwood jewels, delivered to her room by a silent footman, feeling cold and heavy against her throat. She met the Duke at the top of the stairs. He looked magnificent in his evening attire, but his face was as remote as ever. He offered her his arm, his touch impersonal, a necessary courtesy. Dinner was an agony of stilted conversation. The Earl spoke of horses. His wife spoke of gossip. Elara murmured polite responses, feeling like an actress who had forgotten all her lines. "And your family, Duchess?" the Countess asked, her tone laced with a sickly sweetness. "One hears they have had some misfortunes of late. Such a blessing for you, this marriage." The insult was as sharp and clear as a slap. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to offer a dignified, meaningless reply, but before she could speak, the Duke's voice cut through the air, as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "My wife's family is of no concern to you, Lady Ashworth," he said, his amber eyes fixed on the woman. "And you will address her by her proper title. She is your Grace." The table fell silent. The Countess flushed a blotchy, unattractive red. The rest of the meal passed in a thick, uncomfortable quiet. When the guests had finally departed, Elara stood alone in the great hall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, his back to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He did not turn. "I will not have my wife or my name insulted under my own roof." It was a matter of honor, not sentiment. His words were meant to sting, to remind her of the transactional nature of their relationship. But they failed. He had defended her. He had called her my wife. He had shielded her. It was another crack in the ice, wider this time, letting in a warmth that was as terrifying as it was welcome. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood a month after the wedding was heralded by a flurry of activity that disrupted the house's grim tranquility. Carriages arrived, laden with trunks, and servants scurried about with an air of frantic urgency. The Dowager swept into the hall like a galleon in full sail, her silks rustling, her face set in a mask of benevolent authority. "Alistair, my dear boy," she chirped, offering her son a powdered cheek to kiss. "And Elara, you look a little pale, child. Is the country air not agreeing with you?" The Dowager's smile was a brief, sharp thing, like the glint of a needle before it pierces cloth. Her presence was an immediate and suffocating weight. She treated Elara with a cloying condescension, offering unsolicited advice on everything from managing the household staff to the proper way to arrange flowers. Each suggestion was a subtle reminder of Elara's inadequacy, her provincial upbringing, her status as an outsider who owed her very position to the Dowager's largesse. The Dowager's favorite topic was the succession. "A great house like this needs the sound of children's laughter," she would say at the dinner table, her eyes darting between Elara and Alistair. "An heir secures the line. It is a duchess's primary duty after all." Elara would stare at her plate, her face burning, while Alistair remained impassive, his expression unreadable. But she could feel the tension radiating from him, a low hum of irritation that grew with each day his mother was in the house. Alistair's study was his sanctuary. He spent most of his waking hours there, the door firmly closed. Elara had never seen inside. She respected his privacy, understanding his need for a place that was his alone in a life that had been so publicly compromised. She often saw him emerge in the evenings, the faint smudges of charcoal still on his fingers, his expression weary but settled. One afternoon, Elara was passing through the main gallery when she saw the dowager standing before the polished oak door of the study, her hand on the silver knob. "The boy shuts himself away," the dowager said to the maid beside her, her voice sharp with annoyance. "It is not healthy. I need to see what he is doing in there." The maid looked uncomfortable. His Grace gave strict orders. "Your Grace. No one is to enter." "I am his mother," the dowager snapped, and began to turn the handle. A strange impulse moved Elara. It was not a calculated thought, but a pure, protective instinct. She walked forward, her steps silent on the thick carpet. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The Duke is not to be disturbed." The dowager turned, her eyes wide with disbelief. "And who are you to tell me what I may or may not do in my own son's house?" "I am his wife," Elara said simply. She stood directly in front of the door, a small, unmovable obstacle. "And I will not have his wishes disregarded." For a long moment, the two women stared at each other. The dowager's face was a thundercloud of fury. Elara met her gaze without flinching, her heart beating a steady, resolute rhythm. She was defending his space, his privacy, the one part of his life he seemed to control. It felt like the most important thing she had ever done. With a huff of pure indignation, the dowager turned on her heel and swept away, her silks hissing in her wake. Elara remained where she was for a moment, her breath trembling slightly. She had not known she had such strength in her. The door to the study remained closed, but she had the distinct feeling that she had been heard. That evening, a footman delivered a message. His Grace requested her presence in the library after dinner. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. It was the first time he had ever summoned her. She found him standing by the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece. The flames cast shifting shadows across his severe features, softening them. He did not look at her as she entered. "My mother has been a guest here for 2 weeks," he began, his voice low. "You have been unfailingly polite to her, despite her provocations. Today you defied her." "Why?" Elara clasped her hands in front of her. "It is your home, your study, your privacy. She had no right." He was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally turned to face her, the icy mask was gone. In its place was a profound weariness, a vulnerability that startled her. "She did this," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "This marriage. All of it." Elara stared at him, confused. I don't understand. "I was in Scotland, surveying some of the northern estates," he explained, his gaze distant. "I was gone for 2 months. When I returned, it was done. She had negotiated the contract with your father. She had the banns published. She presented me with a choice: marry you, or create a scandal of such magnitude it would ruin your family's name forever and make me a pariah in society." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. His fury at the altar, his coldness, his silence. It had not been directed at her, not personally. It had been directed at the cage his own mother had built around him, a cage in which Elara was simply the other prisoner. "I thought you knew," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought you and your family were her willing accomplices in this scheme. I thought you had conspired to trap me." "No," she breathed, the word catching in her throat. "We were told. We were told you had chosen me. The lie was so cruel, so complete. Her family's desperation had been the dowager's leverage, just as the Duke's honor had been hers. A look of profound regret crossed his face. He took a step toward her. For a month, I have treated you with a coldness you did not deserve. I have made you a stranger in your own home. I can only apologize. The apology hung in the air between them, a fragile, precious thing. He then gestured toward a large portfolio that was leaning against a chair. You defended my privacy today. I feel I owe you an explanation of what it is you were protecting. He opened the portfolio on the large library table. Inside were dozens of sheets of heavy paper, covered in the most intricate and beautiful architectural drawings she had ever seen. There were sketches of facades, detailed floor plans, cross-sections of vaulted ceilings and elegant staircases. The charcoal stains on his fingers suddenly made sense. He was not just a duke. He was an artist, an architect. This is a new wing for St. Giles's Hospital, he said, his voice losing its guarded edge and taking on a quiet passion. The children. Lighter, more air, a place for them to heal. He showed her drawing after drawing, explaining the principles of light and structure, his usual reserve melting away as he spoke of his work. It was, she realized, the only thing in his life he truly controlled. In a world of duty and expectation, this was his freedom. It was the world he built for himself, a world where order and beauty could be created from nothing. She looked from the beautiful, precise drawings to the man standing beside her. She saw not the cold, furious Duke of Blackwood, but a lonely man who had been betrayed by his own mother, a man who poured his silent heart into lines of charcoal on paper. Hope, when it finally came, felt fragile in her chest, like a bird's nest held in cupped hands. This was not the end of her story. It was, perhaps, the beginning. With the truth of the dowager's deception laid bare between them, the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor began to shift. The glacial silence that had defined their marriage thawed into a tentative, watchful quiet. Alistair began to take his meals with her, not in the cavernous dining hall, but in a small, sunlit breakfast room. The conversations were stilted at first, circling around neutral topics: the weather, a book she was reading, the progress on the estate's farms. But it was a beginning. Elara, now armed with understanding, watched the dowager with a new, heightened awareness. The older woman's manipulations, once just irritating, now seemed sinister. Her constant laments about the lack of an heir took on a more menacing tone. She saw the dowager's campaign for what it was, an attempt to isolate Elara, to paint her as a failure, to pave the way for her removal. One afternoon, a new visitor arrived at the manor. A portly, officious-looking man introduced as Dr. Hemlock. The dowager announced that he was an old family physician from London, here for a country visit. But Elara saw the way the doctor avoided Alistair's eyes, the way his gaze kept sliding toward her with a kind of clinical assessment that made her skin crawl. Her suspicions solidified a few days later. She was arranging some late-blooming roses in the morning room when she heard voices from the adjoining conservatory. The dowager and Dr. Hemlock. The doors were slightly ajar, and their words carried on the still air. "The girl is healthy enough," the doctor was saying, his voice low and conspiratorial. "There is no physical reason she could not conceive. Reason is irrelevant." The dowager's voice was sharp, impatient. "What I require is your expert opinion, written and signed. That she is constitutionally delicate, that the chances of her producing a healthy heir are negligible. A barren womb. Doctor, that is the narrative we must establish." Elara froze, the thorny stem of a rose digging into her palm. She felt a chill spread through her, cold and absolute. "It is a serious diagnosis to falsify. Your Grace. The doctor demurred, a note of greed sharpening his tone. My reputation. Your reputation will be padded by £1,000, and my eternal gratitude. The dowager cut in. My son is beginning to soften toward her. We must act quickly. Give me the ammunition I need to press for an annulment, and you will be a wealthy man. I have prepared a letter outlining our agreement. Sign it, and the first installment is yours. Elara backed away from the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. £1,000. A lie to declare her barren, to have her cast aside. It was a betrayal so profound, so vicious, it stole her breath. She retreated up the servants' staircase, her mind racing. She could run to Alistair, tell him everything. He would be furious. He would believe her. He would confront his mother, and the house would be consumed by a firestorm of rage and recrimination. But as she reached the sanctuary of her room, another thought took root. To run to Alistair would be to place her fate in his hands once more. He would be her champion, her protector. She would be the damsel he rescued. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the woman who had stood up to the dowager in defense of a closed door, and she knew, with sudden, brilliant clarity, that she was done being rescued. This was her battle. She would fight it herself. She needed the letter. It was the key. She spent the next day in a state of hypervigilance, watching the dowager's every move. She saw the doctor depart that afternoon, his face flushed with satisfaction. The letter had to be in the dowager's possession. Elara knew she kept a small, locked writing desk in her suite of rooms. That evening, after the house had settled into silence, Elara crept from her room. Her target was the dowager's suite. She had no skill as a thief, but she had observation. She had once seen the dowager's personal maid use a small ornamental key that hung from a chatelaine at her waist. And she knew that maid was a notoriously heavy sleeper. With shaking hands and a heart that felt too large for her chest, Elara slipped into the sleeping maid's small antechamber. The chatelaine lay on the dressing table. She lifted the key, its metal cool against her skin, and retreated, a ghost in her own home. The lock on the writing desk turned with a well-oiled click that sounded like a cannon shot in the silent room. She found the letter almost immediately, tucked beneath a stack of correspondence. It was exactly as she had overheard, a signed, dated agreement to commit medical fraud in exchange for money. She took it, replacing it with a blank sheet of paper, and relocked the desk. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes, but when she was back in her own room, the letter clutched in her hand. She was trembling from head to foot. She held the proof, she held the power. The next morning, she sent a note via a footman. The Duchess of Blackwood requests the Dowager Duchess's presence in the blue drawing room at 11 o'clock. She did not ask. She requested. A summons. She was waiting when the Dowager entered, her expression one of amused curiosity. Elara stood by the fireplace, dressed in a simple day gown of dark grey. She felt calm, her earlier fear burned away by a cold, clear purpose. My dear Elara, the Dowager began, to what do I owe this formal little invitation? Elara did not answer immediately. She gestured to the chair opposite her. When the Dowager was seated, Elara walked to the small table that separated them and placed the letter upon its polished surface. The Dowager's eyes flickered down to the folded paper. She did not recognize it at first. Elara watched as she picked it up, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion, and then, as she read, to a stark, bloodless horror. The mask of benevolent matriarch dissolved, revealing the vicious schemer beneath. Where did you get this? She hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. That is not important, Elara said, her tone even. What is important is that I have it, and I imagine Alistair would be very interested to read it. The Dowager's composure shattered. You would not dare. You would turn my own son against me? You did not hesitate to turn him against me, Elara countered, her voice still quiet, still calm. You lied to him. You lied to me. You purchased this marriage with my family's ruin, and you sought to dissolve it with a paid deception. I think I would dare a great deal. Fear, ugly and raw, flashed in the older woman's eyes. She had underestimated the quiet girl from the country. She had mistaken compliance for weakness. What do you want? The dowager asked, the words forced from her. Money? Jewels? I want you to leave, Elara said. You will have your carriage packed, and you will be gone from Blackwood Manor before luncheon. You will retain your title, your homes, your income. You will live out your days in the comfort to which you are accustomed. But you will never interfere in our lives again. You will never set foot in this house without a direct invitation from me. Your influence here is at an end. She was not destroying her. She was banishing her. She was drawing a line, not of fire and retribution, but of absolute unyielding authority. She was claiming her home. She was claiming her life. The dowager stared at her, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a stunned, sputtering rage. She crumpled the letter in her fist, a useless talisman now. Without another word, she rose to her feet and, with as much dignity as she could muster, swept from the room. Elara did not watch her go. She let out a long, slow breath. The silence that descended was not empty. It was full of peace. It was the sound of victory. The door opened again. It was Alistair. He must have been waiting outside. His face was pale, his amber eyes wide with an emotion she had never seen before, awe. He had heard. He had heard everything. He walked slowly across the room until he stood before her. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had faced down his monstrous mother and won, not with hysterics or accusations, but with quiet strength and unshakable resolve. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not the impersonal gesture of the past, but a warm, firm grasp. His thumb, faintly smudged with charcoal, stroked the back of her hand. Elara, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips was a revelation. He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of staggering respect, of a deep and humbling recognition. It was the sealing of a new contract, one not written on paper or brokered by others, but forged in fire and silence, and finally acknowledged in the quiet of a sunlit room. In that moment, she was not the bride his mother had chosen. She was the woman he was seeing for the very first time. 1 year later, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the West Wing study, illuminating the fine particles of charcoal dust that danced in the air. The room, once Alistair's solitary fortress, had become a shared space. Elara sat in a comfortable armchair near the fire, a book lying open in her lap, though she was not reading. Her attention was on her husband, who stood hunched over his large drafting table, his brow furrowed in concentration. The chill had long since left Blackwood Manor, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fires in its hearths. The servants, who had once moved with fearful quiet, now went about their duties with a relaxed efficiency. Laughter was sometimes heard from the kitchens. The house had a heart again. Elara's hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach. The child within her, a son they now knew, was a quiet promise of the future, a life created not from duty, but from a love that had grown slowly, cautiously, in the spaces between words. Alistair straightened up with a sigh, rubbing the small of his back. He caught her watching him, and a slow smile transformed his usually severe features. The smile still had the power to make her breath catch. He walked over to her, his hands stained with his work, and knelt before her chair. "He is quiet today," Alistair said, placing a large, warm hand over hers on her stomach. "He is contemplating like his father," she replied, her fingers lacing with his. Their life had found a gentle, steady rhythm. He still worked with a fierce dedication on his architectural projects. The children's hospital wing was nearly complete, but his work was no longer an escape. It was a passion he now shared with her. She had shown a surprising aptitude for understanding the spatial relationships in his drawings, for seeing how a line on a page would translate to a feeling in a room. She would often sit with him for hours, offering a quiet suggestion, or simply providing a comforting presence while he wrestled with a difficult design. The dowager had kept to the terms of her exile. They received formal, stilted letters from her on holidays, sent from her dower house or from a fashionable spa in Bath. She had made no attempt to return. Her power had been broken, not by her son's rage, but by her daughter-in-law's quiet, unassailable strength. Alistair's gaze softened as he looked at her. "I was a fool," he said, his voice low. It was a conversation they had had before, in the quiet of the night, but the wonder of it had not faded for him. "I spent a month hating the woman who was saving my life." "You were not hating me," she corrected him gently. "You were hating the cage. I was simply in it with you." He shook his head, his thumb stroking her palm. "My mother thought she was choosing a compliant, powerless bride for a son she could control. She has never been more wrong in her life. She inadvertently chose the one woman with the strength to free us both." He leaned forward and kissed her, a tender, familiar gesture that still held the ghost of that first, revelatory kiss in the blue drawing room. It was a kiss that spoke of shared secrets, of quiet understanding, of a partnership forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Later that afternoon, she stood with him at the drafting table. He was working on the final details for the hospital's entryway. He had sketched a grand, imposing arch. "It feels cold," she said, tracing the line with her finger. "It's a hospital for children. It should feel like an embrace, not a monument." He looked at the drawing, then at her. He handed her a piece of charcoal. "Show me." Her heart gave a little leap. At first she had been hesitant to touch his work, to intrude on his sacred space. But he had encouraged her, valued her eye. Her hand was surprisingly steady as she softened the sharp angles of the arch, adding a subtle curve, sketching in climbing roses around the stone. She was not an artist, but she understood warmth. She understood welcome. He watched her, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he did not say a word. He simply picked up his own piece of charcoal and began to refine her sketch, incorporating her idea into the formal structure, blending her intuitive warmth with his technical precision. Together, their hands dusty with their shared work, they created something new, something better than either could have made alone. That night, as Ilara lay sleeping, Alistair stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds of his estate. He thought of the man he had been a year ago, a man encased in ice, ruled by bitterness and a profound, lonely pride. He had walked into that church planning to make an innocent woman regret every day she spent under his roof. He had not expected her to make him regret the same. He had not expected her to dismantle his prison, brick by silent brick. His mother had chosen the bride, a pawn in her game of power. But love, he had learned, was not a matter of choice or arrangement. It was a matter of recognition. It was seeing the person who held the missing pieces of your own unfinished soul. He looked back at his wife, sleeping peacefully, her hand resting on the future they were building together. His life had been a series of half-finished sketches, precise but empty. Ilara had not just completed them, she had filled them with light,